We'll kick off by examining the actual experience of serving as a crew member on a B-17 Flying Fortress, then gradually dive into ever more unsettling aspects, holding back the most horrific details until the very end. To join the ranks of B-17 aircrews, you first had to endure training, which leads us to the initial shocking reality. At the height of the conflict, when losses were mounting rapidly, the standard 9-month pilot training course got squeezed down to just 9 or 10 weeks. The same rushed timeline applied to gunners, navigators and bombardiers. It's hardly surprising, then, that about 25,000 American airmen perished in training mishaps during the war, without facing any enemy fire. Not everyone was from B-17 units, but most were, since the Flying Fortress served as the primary heavy bomber in the European theatre until the B-24 Liberator and B-29 Superfortress entered service. A major factor in these crashes was practicing close formation flying. Early on, when German fighters were shredding B-17 formations, the bombers had to bunch up tightly, with wings overlapping those of neighbouring aircraft above and below. The goal was to maximise the defensive coverage from their onboard machine guns, making it tougher for the Luftwaffe to penetrate. Yet maintaining such precision over extended flights, especially under fire from flak or assaults, proved incredibly challenging, let alone mastering it initially. Crews often describe takeoff and assembly in formation as the toughest phase of any mission, particularly in England's dismal, fog-shrouded skies. Bombers had to launch from their bases at breakneck pace, with just 30 to 45 seconds between departures, the second plane already rolling as the first neared the runway's end without lifting off. Once airborne, they needed to coalesce into the group. To aid this, specialised older B-17 models, dubbed assembly ships, featured distinct paint schemes and markings for easier spotting. Needless to say, mid-air collisions were all too common and disastrous in aircraft laden with bombs and fuel. If you made it through training unscathed, the next hurdle was coping with the harsh realities of operating from a flying fortress, which was tougher than it might seem. When the plane was designed, pressurized cabins remained largely experimental, so the B-17 operated without one. That meant no onboard mechanism to regulate internal air pressure during ascent. As altitude increased, the atmosphere thinned rapidly, dropping the pressure accordingly. Unlike today's jets, where you breathe comfortably, B-17 crew face the external environment's rarefied air directly. At 20,000 to 30,000 feet, oxygen levels dipped to roughly 1/3 of sea level norms, insufficient for normal bodily functions. Inhaling felt like drawing breath through a narrow tube. Without supplemental oxygen, dizziness and disorientation set in within minutes, followed by unconsciousness. Add in the sub-zero chill and howling drafts seeping through every gunport, and you get a sense of the brutal combat conditions. Crews endured something akin to hurtling along at 200 miles per hour in a convertible with the top down. Only this road hovered 30,000 feet aloft, with temperatures plummeting to around -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Thus, the top threats to personnel before encountering foes were hypoxia and frostbite. To counter this, Flying Fortress teams relied on oxygen masks and heated suits. Unfortunately, both setups were infamously prone to failure, and missions traversed heavily defended German skies where defenders unleashed every tactic to thwart raids on their territory. A speeding tracer from countless flak bursts, or a Luftwaffe interceptor's cannon and machine gun rounds could pierce the thin aluminium fuselage and wreck vital gear, spelling doom. The primary oxygen supply ran at low pressure on purpose to avoid catastrophic explosions if damaged, but backup walk-around bottles offered only brief emergency relief while shifting positions inside the bomber. These provided mere minutes of breath, forcing a descent to denser air or an evacuation. Survivors recounted how a system malfunction would lead to someone simply nodding off. If comrades didn't reach them in 5 minutes, they were lost. On the thermal front, prolonged high-altitude exposure transformed the unpressurized interior into an icy blast chamber. To stave off death, crews donned blue bunny suits, electrically warmed outfits designed for survival. Yet, just like the oxygen gear, vulnerabilities abounded, and either the extreme cold would overheat you or, even worse, cause the systems to fail, leaving you exposed to frostbite or the risk of dying from hypothermia. Frostbite occurred frequently, and handling machine guns barehanded could result in losing skin or even fingers with ease. The temperatures were so brutal that when a person got wounded, their blood would freeze right as it left the body. This isn't exaggeration. Veterans recounted it firsthand. It's hard for us today to grasp the sheer discomfort and peril of piloting a B-17 in those cumbersome flight suits, with a parachute strapped to your back, while squeezed into a tight station, constantly scanning the skies for incoming enemy aircraft. This leads to the other two primary threats B-17 crews faced beyond their own aircraft once they crossed into enemy territory. Germany's primary defense against aircraft was their rapid-firing cannons, notoriously called Flak. About 1 million German personnel operated tens of thousands of these weapons, arranged in defensive rings around key cities and industrial sites that the B-17s naturally aimed to strike. There was little crews could do, except hope the burst didn't land too near their plane. Those 88mm flak shells were directed by German radar and sophisticated fire control tech that coordinated multiple guns simultaneously, unleashing a barrage in mere moments. Each projectile tipped the scales at around 10 kilograms, packing 1 kilogram of explosives. Upon detonation, it sent shrapnel flying in a lethal zone that pierced the thin duralumin skin of the bomber and anything in its path, such as human tissue. These were the dark smoke clouds visible in World War II films. At times, the flak barrages grew so dense that airmen felt like they could step out and stroll across them. Impacts from flak inflicted gruesome injuries on the body, and survivors often endured deep psychological scars from witnessing buddies lose their heads or get bisected by fragments. Teams wore flak jackets, yet they offered no safeguard against shards striking the neck or face. A direct shell strike, particularly before the bombs were released, defied words. Still, the Flying Fortress amazed all by limping back from sorties with huge chunks of the fuselage gone. Some endured explosions inside the aircraft, arriving home sans cockpit or limping on just 1 or 2 of 4 engines, defying all odds. The same applied to assaults from German fighters. As raids grew fiercer, the Germans shifted crack Luftwaffe aces from the Eastern Front to specialise in downing bombers. Planes such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109, Focke-Wulf FWW-190, or the dreaded Me-262 jet toward war's end, bristled with 20mm and 30mm autocannons, plus heavy machine guns. They even tested early air-to-air rockets against bomber groups, where a single accurate volley could ravage a B-17's interior. Initial B-17 variants that the British experimented with lacked a tail gunner and mounted just a handful of .30 caliber machine guns. Such setups fared poorly against fighter assaults. Later, the Flying Fortress Model G upgraded to 13.50 caliber guns in various turrets and paired setups. In response, Germans adopted a bold strategy. When a B-17 lacked nose guns, they'd charge straight at it, unleashing prolonged fire into the cockpit to obliterate the pilots and instruments. This tactic proved devastating until forward-firing guns were hastily added. Initially, flying in formations offered scant defence against interceptors, leading to devastating shoot-downs. Due to the ammo load's heft, their .50 caliber guns held enough rounds for roughly 1 minute of continuous fire. Thus, facing waves of German fighters left them ammo dry and defenceless in no time. Of the 5,548 US heavy bombers lost in action, about 2,400 fell to flak, another 2,400 to fighters, and the remaining roughly 700 to other causes like crashes or breakdowns. Certain raids saw B-17s endure ruinous casualties, mainly from enemy fighters. At the outset, experts thought massed machine guns and close formations would suffice. But disasters like the attacks on the U-boat Pen, where nearly 20% of B-17s were downed, shattered that illusion. Eventually, Allied escorts, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings and Spitfires accompanied the bombers. When German interceptors showed up, they'd tangle in fierce dogfights to shield the heavies. However, these fighters suffered from far shorter ranges than the bombers, as they weren't built for deep strikes into hostile lands but for operations near their home fields. So, the fighters would accompany the bombers for as far as their fuel permitted. Once they reached the point where they had barely enough to return to base, the escorts had no choice but to peel off, abandoning the bombers to press ahead unaccompanied. Since the Allies aimed to strike key factories manufacturing components for German fighter planes, those bombers were left exposed during the riskiest stretch of the flight without protection. This vulnerability led to the grim events of two Black Thursdays, the bleakest days for B-17 aircrews. The initial one occurred during the Regensburg and Schweinfurt raid on August 17, 1943, featuring a bold dual assault on aircraft production sites far inside Germany. The strategy involved splitting into two formations to mislead the German defences, forcing them to pick just one target. Post-bombing, one force would divert to North African airfields while the other returned to England. Yet poor visibility delayed the groups by hours rather than coordinating them in unison, allowing the Germans to pounce on each separately. After the fighter cover withdrew, the unescorted bombers were soon overwhelmed by relentless packs of Luftwaffe aircraft, which hammered them before retreating to reload and refuel, only to return for more. The raid's results were underwhelming, factory damage that got fixed in mere weeks. From the 376 B-17s dispatched, 60 fell to enemy fire, 90 were wrecked irreparably, and roughly 600 crew members perished or vanished, with numerous others ending up in captivity. Undeterred by the setback and eager to avoid repeating errors, Allied leaders mounted another attempt. That brought the second Black Thursday, a repeat strike on those same objectives on October 14, 1943. Radar detected the incoming bombers, prompting over 300 Luftwaffe fighters to scramble against them. Of the 291 B-17 sent out, 77 were downed and 120 suffered heavy damage. Once more, around 600 airmen died, went missing, or were seized. In response, these long-range penetrations were paused for a time. The introduction of long-range escorts equipped with drop tanks eventually addressed the issue, particularly once the P-51 Mustang entered service and could shadow the bombers to Berlin and home again. Still, danger loomed constantly. While fighter threats diminished, flak remained a persistent menace until the war's close. As history shows, casualties ran so steep across various phases of the air offensive that the Allies nearly scrapped it altogether. Yet at the cost of countless bomber personnel and vast civilian tolls, they forged ahead. Some argue the effort cut the war short by a year, though it likely inflicted needless devastation and loss of innocent lives. In 1943, typical mission loss rates hovered around 8%, spiking to 30% on the deadliest outings. At those rates, just roughly one-third of crews could realistically complete their required 25 missions, a threshold that eventually climbed to 30, then 35. About 38% of them succeeded, but the rest met death, imprisonment, or injury. Over 26,000 8th Air Force personnel lost their lives, and more than 28,000 became prisoners. This leads to another sobering reality: the fate of those who survived to be captured. When it became clear a bomber wouldn't make it back, the pilot would sound the bailout alert. If feasible, he'd keep her level on autopilot to aid the crew's escape through tight hatches, encumbered by flight gear and cumbersome chutes. Often, though, the plane was in a deadly spin, with the team battling centrifugal forces amid flames and wreckage. Typically, only half succeeded in jumping clear. Even then, evading collision with the plummeting aircraft was just step one. Next came ensuring the parachute didn't snag on debris, catch fire, or fail to open. Safely airborne, they drifted downward defencelessly. Occasionally, German pilots would machine gun the dangling figures, prompting Allies to design smaller chutes for quicker descents, reducing exposure, but resulting in jolting impacts akin to leaping from a second-story ledge. Upon landing, they confronted locals whose loved ones and homes had suffered from the very ordnance their squadrons unleashed. A few were detained peacefully and held as POWs until liberation, but many endured far worse. It's no surprise that civilians, grieving potential losses from the barrage of explosives you and your mates had rained down, harboured deep resentment. Nazi media branded Allied pilots as terror bombers, a label that in truth wasn't far off. Records indicate that approximately 1,000 Allied airmen fell victim to lynchings by enraged crowds before the regular German troops might have taken them prisoner. Take the Russelheim massacre as a case in point. A furious crowd stoned 6 out of 8 airmen to death, and there were plenty more such episodes where the full story only came out long after the conflict ended. Post-war courts did try some soldiers and ordinary folks for murdering Flying Fortress crew members in custody, though just a handful faced punishment since gathering solid evidence proved incredibly tough. Once you wound up in a POW camp, a stretch of dull, grueling misery awaited, made all the more brutal if you'd suffered bad wounds during your escape from the plane. Rations were meagre, facilities often dismal, and roughly 1,300 Allied aircrew who got captured perished in detention from all sorts of causes. Plenty of those who endured until liberation ended the war, tipping the scales at a mere 80 pounds, their bodies wrecked beyond repair. The B-17 unleashed around 640,000 tons. From the Allies' overall 1.6 million tons of ordnance rained down during the entire campaign. The devastation those explosives wrought below was pure nightmare fuel. Early on, the aerial assault focused on factories and army sites, but it soon morphed into hammering anything remotely German. The approach shifted to huge swarm attacks and what they dubbed pattern bombing. On peak outings, swarms of hundreds, sometimes nearing 1,000 B-17s, would sweep over German urban centres, flattening them outright. They unleashed mixes of blast bombs and fire starters to ignite infernos that swallowed entire metropolises in flames. Estimates put German non-combatant fatalities anywhere from 500,000 to 800,000, with over 120 towns reduced to shattered wasteland. Chances are you've come across infamous cases like Dresden, which held zero real military value, but still got pounded non-stop for more than 3 days, under 4,000 tons of payload that nearly erased it from existence. That single onslaught claimed about 25,000 lives, just like that. Then there was the Hamburg barrage, a relentless 10-day affair that wiped out 40,000 civilians. With all that grim detail laid out, it's time to shift to the jaw-dropping tales, the ones that truly stunned everyone because they really unfolded. On February 1st, 1943, a squadron of B-17s lifted off from Biskra in Algeria, bound for the Nazi-held harbours in Tunisia. One of those planes, nicknamed All-American by its team, unloaded its load and banked around for the 300-mile haul home when a pair of Me-109s barreled in for a frontal assault. The defensive guns blazed away, sending the lead enemy spiralling down in a blaze. But as the trailing fighter peeled off, its pilot took a round and veered wildly. The doomed Me-109 zipped past the waist gunner by mere inches, its wing slicing right through the All-American's rear section, shearing it almost entirely free from the main body. The tail gunner's spot clung to the aircraft solely via thin aluminium shreds on the right flank and scraps of decking. From a nearby B-17, Lieutenant Charles Cutforth snapped a shot that turned into one of the war's most unforgettable aerial photos. A fortress dangling its aft end by a sliver, defying gravity somehow. Nearly all the tail's control lines were gone, along with half the vital flight components. By every standard of flying, it had no business staying aloft. Miraculously, though, the automatic pilot had kicked in right at the collision. Relying on electric circuits and powered actuators rather than the wrecked manual linkages, the flight crew managed to wrestle the damaged beast level as the rear end whipped and bucked. The group throttled back to guard their crippled comrade, and against all logic, the All-American limped home for a safe touchdown with nobody aboard, hurt badly. Crews even patched it up and sent it back into action right through war's close. If that's hard to buy, consider this next one. Over Saint-Nazaire, France, on January 3rd, 1943, during a major strike on the U-boat docks, 20-year-old ball turret gunner Alan Margie was aboard the B-17 dubbed Snap, Crackle Pop. He already had 6 sorties under his belt. But the 7th etched itself into his memory forever. Approaching the objective, the heavens erupted in flak bursts. One shell crippled an engine, followed by a solid strike that mangled the right wing. As the bomber tumbled helplessly in a death spin, Alan scrambled to escape his perch. The turret measured just 4 feet across at most, leaving no room for his chute inside, so it stayed stowed up in the main cabin. In a crisis, he'd have to swivel into position, pop the lid, clamber over, snag the pack, harness up, and leap, all amid potential inferno or structural failure, exactly the chaos unfolding then. He barely squeezed into the body of the plane, only to discover his parachute riddled and useless from shrapnel. As the B-17 disintegrated around 20,000 feet, yet another flak round detonated, hurling Alan clear into the void, without any backup. Tumbling from nearly 4 miles high, oxygen starvation and biting freeze sapped his consciousness. Moments later, his limp form crashed through the glass ceiling of the Saint-Nazaire train station. He crashed into the station, but the slanted structure decelerated his descent sufficiently to prevent a fatal landing. German troops discovered him still alive, suffering from a fractured right arm and leg, damage to his nose and an eye, plus 28 shrapnel injuries, hanging on by a thread. Shocked to find him breathing, they rushed him medical attention right away. Following care, he pulled through and endured 18 months as a POW, until Allied troops freed his camp in 1945. He went on to reach 84 years old. He himself couldn't quite explain his survival. Yet Alan wasn't alone in his ordeal. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran operated the tail guns on a B-17 dubbed Ricky Tick Taravi amid a mission over Germany. Enemy Luftwaffe fighters hammered the bomber. He took bullets in both arms. A blast cracked his ribs. Compounding the chaos, his parachute lay in tatters. Then a devastating strike ripped the tail clean off the main body, leaving Moran trapped in the isolated section as it spiraled earthward from roughly 20,000 feet. Plunging at about 100 feet per second, he quit fighting it, braced for what seemed inevitable doom, and attempted to steady himself. The plummeting tail snagged a towering pine, cushioning the drop enough to spare his life upon hitting the ground. Arriving German soldiers gaped in disbelief at his signs of life. His wounds were grave, featuring a smashed skull among them. Still, after treatment, a Serbian POW doctor tended to him using limited resources and miraculously sustained him. Moran lasted through 18 months in German POWs camps and lived to witness his release. Back in January 1944, tail gunner James, aboard a B-17 named Skippy, faced a parallel nightmare close to Athens, when his aircraft smashed into another fortress amid clouds. Similar to Moran, he hurtled downward enclosed in the severed tail. During the descent, he remained oblivious that the plane had broken apart. What seemed an endless free fall stretched on for a few minutes before the tail clipped trees, halting his plunge and preserving him. He extricated himself from the wreckage and only then grasped his isolation. Later, James got saved by Greek Orthodox monks. If you figure that enduring a 20,000-foot drop sans parachute or navigating tailless amounted to the pinnacle of bomber fortune, ponder the fate of the B-17 Lovely Julie above Cologne on October 15, 1944, after a direct flak strike sheared away the whole front end. First Lieutenant Lawrence de Lansancy had barely seen his bombardier drop the payload when a shell detonated in the nose area. The explosion claimed Staff Sergeant George Abbott on the spot, though his form shielded the crew from much of the flying shrapnel. The nose section vanished entirely. Plexiglass and aluminum casing evaporated, exposing the forward area completely. The instrument panel lay in ruins. Airspeed indicator, altimeter, compass, all absent. The oxygen setup had also been obliterated. Facing the lone viable path, de Lansancy descended to a breathable height, despite placing them in the crosshairs of every German battery from Cologne to the Channel. Navigator Raymond Léaud had forfeited his charts and gear to the blast, forcing him to steer them back across hostile lands without aids, all while icy gales lashed their faces and the aircraft teetered on collapse. Nevertheless, they traversed the Channel in this barely flyable condition and made it to England. Lacking functional flaps or brakes, de Lansancy managed to set the crippled fortress down on the tarmac without catastrophe, earning him the Silver Star.